Somewhere along my journey, I've learned to really enjoy what the Old Testament stories have to tell us. Last Sunday's Old Testament story was from the Genesis story of Abram and Sarai. Within this story, God forms an everlasting covenant with Abram for him to be the ancestor and give rise to a multitude of nations. And he promises his barren wife, Sarai, will bear a son, and they're both transformed by God and become Abraham and Sarah. I will bless her, and she shall give rise to nations. Kings of people shall come from her. Within this text, you hear the deep value of women, as well as the vast importance of their presence in the world of the past, present, and future. God holds women in the highest of esteem and value. God acknowledges the feminine as divine within Sarah, and consequently all women. This is how women are to be treated within the covenant of the love of God, within the covenant created between Abraham and the community. So clearly, we don't always live up to our covenants with God, not in the past nor in the present. We already know how important stories are to form and help define our identities, and the necessary and vital sense of belonging to family and community, our history, and most importantly, belonging to God. The Jewish faith has existed and flourished for centuries through the continuous repetition of their stories. And whether or not a story supports or denigrates a person in their community is of utmost importance. The story of Abraham, Sarah, and their ancestors is no exception as an important story of the Jewish tradition. Sarai has been living on the fringes of her culture. First, she's a woman, and she's a barren woman. And her potential cultural and personal sense of shame and failure as a result of her barrenness, along with a painful longing for a child of her own, fearing of being cast out by her husband, all help to create the groundwork for the destructive dynamic between her and Hagar. Feeling a need to fulfill her duty of providing Abraham with an heir, Sarai sends her maidservant Hagar to Abraham in hopes of her providing the male heir that she cannot provide, and she succeeds. All of this, of course, only deepens the dynamic between the two women. Then God's promise for Sarai to become Sarah and provide Abraham with an heir is also finally fulfilled. Now, Sarah holds an additional fear for her own child and begins to abuse Hagar, and she demands Hagar be banished along with her son, which Abraham does. In this story, God embraces Sarai, who has in many respects been cast out by others. He transforms Sarai into Sarah, who will give rise to nations. While Hagar has been banished, God also meets her and also embraces and cares for her and forms a covenant. She's told to return to Sarah and Abraham and just put up with it. Her child will also give rise to nations. Hagar's also most likely lived in a fear of being uncared for. She isn't even in charge of decisions around bearing her own children due to the cultural beliefs and standards of her community. She, too, feels a deep need to care for her child and provide for him. Hagar was abused and banished not only by her fictive kinship sister Sarai, but also by her family, Abraham, and the community at large. She is considered less than others. Yet, despite Sarah and Hagar's flaws and failings, and despite their inability to take in the transformational love of God they received and embrace each other with this love, God still gives them voice, acknowledges and supports their value to the community at large and its future expression. Where do we see God calling our community at large to participate in God's covenant? Norma Bowles is one individual among many who are involved in a combination of social activism and theater. She participated in a project to form a theater group of individuals who also live on the fringes of their community. Individuals segregated by the beliefs and the standards and the destructive stories assigned to them by the communities and the cultures they live in, whose communities believe they are less than, and perhaps not even worthy to be considered children of God, the queer community. Norma and her group wanted to find out what would happen if they created, produced, and performed a stage presentation from this fringe community's stories and idea backgrounds. Present a perspective on how our insistence on defining certain people and groups as less than has impacted their lives and leads to a manifestation of abuse and intolerance and oppression by others. Many of these youth had been forced out of their homes where it was not uncommon to have violence and abuse directed at them. And the California group, many landed in West Hollywood in hopes of finding a more supportive community. Ironically, when they arrived, they still found isolation and banishment. They were mostly living on the streets and still threatened by violence against them by the dominant community. So they formed their own communities. Unfortunately, as well, these newly created communities repeated the destructive characteristics of community they had learned and imposed their own sense of oppression and abuse. Something needed to be done to break these seemingly endless destructive cycles. And it was from this environment that the theater group was formed in the hope of providing a platform where the sharing of their voices, being told by the youth, they could encounter a healing of their wounds and discover a newfound sense of empowerment. Who would be their audience? Realistically, the program directors knew the audience had to be somewhat self-selected and hold a degree of interest regarding the queer community in the first place. But despite this self-selection, there were still many who left the event with a heightened sense of understanding and empathy and a strong desire to pass these stories along. One of the primary criteria of the production was each member of the cast would always be present on the stage, no matter how big or little of a voice they held in the play performance. They wanted the audience to be continually reminded of how many youth were impacted and how deeply they were wounded by our societal practices of prejudice, isolation and banishment these youth were subjected to. And despite some failures and youth returning to oppressive and dangerous lifestyles of drug addiction and prostitution, many youth were indeed able to escape this destructive lifestyle and find their higher sense of individual self-worth and purpose. What would the Bible sound like or the stories look like if we put all the women of the Abraham story or any of the other voiceless women throughout the Bible on a stage with all of their fates and mistreatments portrayed and voiced by them? How would the audience feel hearing how deeply they had been impacted by the treatment they had received? Would the audience respond by embracing them into the community with a sense of belonging? Make way for an environment of belonging for all and pass the story on to neighboring communities and generations to come? Would the voicing of their stories provide them with the means to begin healing the wounds from the violences directed against them? Would they be empowered by hearing their own voices being heard? One can only speculate and hope that these voiceless women in these stories can be used today for the voices of the women who need healing in today's world. Our jobs are to look within the stories, hear the words and heart of God, recognize the ideals we are asked to live up to, and further recognize implementing these ideals remains to this day a necessary repetition of God's word and God's heart. As was the transformational spirit of God present and accounted for in the lives of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, this same transformational Spirit of God was present in the lives of the theater production participants, both on the stage and in the audience.